Hello, my name's Olurotimi Osha. I've been experiencing a perversion of justice in Montgomery County, Maryland. It made me realize that Montgomery County's judiciary, their court system, their circuit court, they epitomize judicial kakistocracy. Kakistocracy is like leadership of the most corrupt or leadership of the most unqualified or whatever. But I'm not going to talk about just because of legal proceedings. I'm not going to discuss directly my experience, but in any event, I've seen judges tell lies, intentionally misrepresent the law. I've seen prosecutors use inadmissible evidence. I've seen prosecutors openly lie in court, committing perjury, fraud, or commit fraud upon the court. Police officers of Montgomery County shamelessly commit perjury, and the judge knows they've committed perjury. And so it's unfortunate. You wonder why Maryland has the highest incarceration rate of black men in America. So now I know. But in any event, that ordeal, seeing that Montgomery County, Maryland, which is right next to the capital, right, the federal capital, where the seat of government is. It's pretty close to where the White House is. In case people don't realize, Washington D.C. is actually carved out of Maryland, the state of Maryland, and nearby Virginia. So I've come to realize that the judiciary in Montgomery County is the epicenter of corruption, and there's hardly anything anyone can do about it. But I'm a historian. I have a law degree myself from George Washington University Law School, an excellent law school. I learned a lot. I'm glad I went there. I'm glad I did international human rights law, the program at Oxford University, and I'm glad I studied further at Bocconi University in Milan, in Italy. I also took criminal law and was an intellectual property law fellow. All that experience evoked an era in America where it's typically regarded as the most corrupt period in American history, the era of the spoils system, right? You've heard the expression, to the victor go the spoils. This was supposed to have been coined by, well, in American political usage, that is, it's supposed to have been coined in U.S. politics by a senator, William L. Marcy, in 1832. The notion that, America had developed the two-party system, and so whichever party won, was the belief that all the jobs, all the federal government jobs, all the contracts, everything should go to the winning party. So we had the civil service, right? The civil service lacked qualifications back then. The federal civil service, the federal government controlled a lot of important jobs. And back then, whichever president or party was in power, they controlled the patronage system, also called the spoil system. So they gave jobs to party acolytes. Those party acolytes would pay a percentage of their salary. They were required to pay a percentage of their salary, usually very lucrative, right? Federal government jobs and civil service, back to the party. So the party could continue to run their campaigns to win the government, right? To win the federal government. So that was called the patronage system, right? So the president, the party machine, when they won elections, they would dole out, they would give out, dispense jobs to their acolytes, their party members. And those party members were required to pay a percentage of their salaries back to the party, right? So the party remains strong. So for Nigerians who continue to criticize corruption, yes, you should, but know that America that you think is paved with gold and is paradise, is euphoria, or is El Dorado, it's not. We have a history as well. And we have a history, our party system was very corrupt. And again, like I said, my experience, in the legal system, where I was swatted, it was state action. They fabricated things. I've talked about how Judiciary, a Howard University professor, was suborned to commit perjury, and when he suborned by Montgomery County Police, and in all likelihood, senior executives, rogue agents of the Department of the Navy, Department of Defense. And when I was swatted, they filed false charges against me. The police officers who shot me in the head, who injured me, then said I assaulted them. And right, so it's ironic. Of course, they have rigged jurors in Montgomery County, Maryland, right? A rigged jury, tainted juror system. It's like, an analogy is like a woman is violated in her apartment, and she's raped. And after she's raped by a police officer, and then somehow she, trying to defend herself from rape in her own home, in her own apartment, she breaks a button on the police officer's uniform. And then this Montgomery County, Maryland, the state of Maryland, charges her with assault for breaking the button of the police officer who raped her in her home. They don't know each other, right? So that's sort of what has happened. So Montgomery County, Maryland is so corrupt. They have these corrupt judges who violate you. They have corrupt cops. They commit perjury. And hopefully I filed a complaint with the United Nations, so hopefully they're scrutinizing. There was an investigator I spoke with, and the FBI, they've spoken with me several times, but nothing's done. But these judges are, wow, the epitome of corruption. But I'm not going to talk about them today. God is the ultimate judge of everything. I like to talk about American history, and I'm taking us back to a very corrupt era in American history. And I'm going to be talking about a very complicated president, Chester A. Arthur. Chester A. Arthur is the man who cleaned up the spoil system. He ended the spoil system. He cleaned up corruption in the civil service with the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act. It's ironic because no president benefited more from the political corruption in the civil service system. His main patron was a man called Roscoe Conkling. By the way, these characters I'm talking about were all brilliant men. They were extremely brilliant men. They were lawyers. Chester A. Arthur was a lawyer. Roscoe Conkling, one of the most brilliant lawyers. Roscoe Conkling was a kingmaker from New York, right? He came from an aristocratic, privileged, Brahmin family in New York, and he was a lawyer, very brilliant, very early. Roscoe Conkling, giant of a man. He was very tall. He was a notorious womanizer as well. But he was. It's ironic that even though he was so corrupt, he was the main drafter of the 14th Amendment that we so value today. He was a main drafter, made it pass. So he was really the most powerful man in America in his era until he retired. He resigned early from party politics because he was disappointed, because his protege, Chester A. Arthur, ended the spoils system, right? So Roscoe Conkling, like I said, the 14th Amendment we all talk about, we owe it to Roscoe Conkling, the great mind of Roscoe Conkling. Very brilliant lawyer. He was so brilliant a lawyer that he was actually offered the position of Chief Justice of the United States, even though he wasn't serving as a judge, he was a senator. He turned it down. He was offered that's the position of Chief Justice of the United States by President Ulysses S. Grant, one of my favorite presidents, the hero who won the Civil War on behalf of the Union and preserved the Union, right? The commanding general. But Roscoe Conkling turned it down. And then his protege, after his protege became president, he was offered again, was it in 1883 or something like that? He was offered, or after maybe 1882, something like that. He was offered the position again as Associate Justice. And this time he was even confirmed by the Senate. Senate went and voted and confirmed him. Chester A. Arthur wanted to make sure that, look, you're not going to have a problem being confirmed. Just take this position. Roscoe Conkling turned it down, and famously or infamously, he said that taking a position on the Supreme Court, right, would have him forever gnawing at his chains, right? He loved the power, the flexibility, the power he had as a senator and a party boss from New York. He said he loved the rough and tumble of politics, right? So he was a kingmaker. So there was a period in American history, the period of the party machine, the kingmakers, and Roscoe Conkling was a kingmaker from the Republican Party. He led the Stalwarts Party, and the Stalwarts Party tried to get President Ulysses Grant a third term. It failed, and of course they tried to. He was against those radicals. The radicals wanted to reform the spoil system. They wanted to end the patronage system because it made America extremely corrupt. America was very corrupt during that time, the civil service, and they wanted to end it. And Roscoe Conkling, it's funny because he's the hero of the 14th Amendment. You'd have to know U.S. history to know Roscoe Conkling. He's very instrumental again in the creation of the 14th Amendment, which we all admire. And I think that's a complexity, the paradox of America, right? We find these very flawed men who, they were part of a very corrupt system, but there are things that they did well, right? Roscoe Conkling was he was a kingmaker, the man who controlled the spoil system, right? That was it created one of the most corrupt civil service systems. But at the same time, he's the man who gave us the 14th Amendment, right? And so what happened? So Chester A. Arthur, another very complex man. Again, by the way, these presidents, Chester A. Arthur was the vice president to James Garfield, right? So James Garfield and Chester A. Arthur, these two men, through psychometrics, they're amongst our presidents who have the highest IQs. Like our presidents who had the highest IQs were our early presidents, the first few presidents we had after our founding. Then it declines, and then up onto James Garfield and Chester A. Arthur. Ironically, they had exactly the same IQ, roughly. The psychometrics thing. The studies I looked at, I examined. They had the exact same IQs as James Garfield was our 20th president, who was assassinated by the lunatic and disgruntled job seeker Charles Guiteau, who was a lawyer. Again, this is a tale of lawyers. That's why I said the corruption in Montgomery County, Maryland's judiciary evokes this era of the U.S. presidents. So James Garfield, 20th president, was a lawyer. Of course, the only president to have a mathematical proof, and also he was a pastor. He was a lawyer, a pastor. He did many things. He was a hero in the Civil War, became a major general. Chester A. Arthur became a brigadier general in the Civil War, but he dealt with material and logistics. He didn't, see combat. He didn't command anything like army or anything. He didn't see battle. Because he was also, he was a very brilliant man, right? That's Chester A. Arthur. He was a lawyer as well, born in Vermont. And the IQ of presidents drops significantly. So after them, IQs drop up to the point of Teddy Roosevelt, and then roughly Woodrow Wilson, our 28th president, our only president to also have been a professor, right? Who had a PhD. He had several degrees. He was a lawyer. He had a PhD, and he was president of Princeton, by the way. And then later on, he got into politics by being governor of New Jersey, right? So um, then IQs drop precipitously up until JFK. Then it drops again up until Jimmy Carter. By the way, Jimmy Carter was one very smart president. He was a nuclear engineer. I should talk about Jimmy Carter sometime. Of course, he's our only president to have been a centenarian, right? A centenarian was he died at 100 years old, right? Um, After Jimmy Carter, it drops then until Bill Clinton, right? So basically, but these two guys, James Garfield, right? This era had very brilliant men in our politics, and we had brilliant leaders. And Chester A. Arthur had never run for elective office, never in his life. He benefited from the spoil system. He was the protege of Roscoe Conkling, so he had one of the most lucrative jobs in the US government. He made more money in this position as collector of the Port of New York um, than the president of the United States, right? The president made what, like $50,000 then. The base salary of the collector of the Port of New York was about $12,000, but he made a percentage of imports, fines, penalties, all of that. He made additional money, right, on the side, and it surpassed over 50,000, surpassed what the president of the United States made. So he was rich as a government civil servant, right? So he didn't want to leave that job, but there were these people who were called radicals, and they wanted to reform the corrupt civil service system. And they were a faction of the Republican Party. Roscoe Conkling was, part of the stalwarts. They said no, and they believed to the victor go the spoils. That yes, they needed the spoil system. So there was this group, this faction within the Republican Party that wanted to reform this, end the spoil system. So eventually they elect James Garfield. James Garfield was not interested in the presidency. He was a congressman. He was an accidental president, and it's unfortunate that he became the second U.S. president to be assassinated. So James Garfield just showed up to support his friend, and then he was a compromise candidate. And then, as another compromise, they picked a vice president who was the protege of Roscoe Conkling. That's Chester A. Arthur, to appease Roscoe Conkling, right? And which ticked off Roscoe Conkling. I don't think he ever spoke with Chester A. Arthur again. He was upset because he thought Chester A. Arthur betrayed him. Chester A. Arthur had no interest. He had never sought nor won or participated in elective office. He had just been a civil servant. He was a lawyer. By the way, there's something else that Chester A. Arthur is known for. Let me just quickly mention. Chester A. Arthur, as a young man in New York, as a young lawyer, he participated, he led a lawsuit, a civil rights lawsuit. It was actually a landmark civil rights lawsuit on behalf of a black woman who was a school teacher, Elizabeth Jennings Graham. She had been forcibly removed from a streetcar in New York because of her race, and so she was humiliated. So Chester A. Arthur, as a young lawyer, then represented her, and he won on her behalf, and she won damages, and she went on. It also, that lawsuit that he won, also became the direct cause for the desegregation of streetcar lines in New York. It was filed in the Brooklyn Circuit Court of New York. So Chester A. Arthur, again, like I said, complicated man. So he's doing the Lord's work, fighting against segregation, right? He has his name on a landmark case that instigates desegregation. This was in 1854, before slavery ended, before the Civil War. He won a case in 1854 desegregating streetcar lines in New York on behalf of, it helped black people to be able to ride on desegregated cars in New York before the Civil War. But he benefits from this very corrupt civil service spoil system in the civil service. So what caused him to have a change of heart was that, again, he was just, they picked him as a vice president to James Garfield, who had no interest either. It was just a congressman. I think James Garfield is the only one who went from congressman directly. He was not a senator. He went from congressman to become president of the United States, right? To be elected president of the United States. And he wasn't interested. And so Chester A. Arthur had been picked as, appeasement to appease Roscoe Conkling. But Roscoe Conkling felt Chester A. Arthur was stabbing him in the back. So, well, not really. He thought, okay, that, well, he would be able to manipulate Chester A. Arthur, right? Even after this happened, because they picked him on the ticket just to appease Roscoe Conkling, the great kingmaker, right? Who had been offered Chief Justice of the United States. He turned it down. Unfortunately, there was a disgruntled, I've done a video talking about Charles Guiteau, the disgruntled job seeker. He was a lawyer who was actually crazy. And he ends up killing James Garfield, and he shot James Garfield because he wanted a job, and he was so delusional. He thought that by murdering James Garfield, that Chester A. Arthur, when he became president, he was going to give the job. He was going to give the job he wanted. He wanted to be a diplomat, right? He was going to give the job, a federal job, to Charles Guiteau. Guiteau was so delusional. Of course, he died by execution. He was killed, was sentenced, convicted, executed. But so when Chester A. Arthur becomes president, because of this crooked spoil system, he, of course, there are people who are suspicious. But people understood that Chester A. Arthur was not interested in being president because he was going to be losing money. He made more money as the collector of the Port of New York than the president of the United States, right? That was what he loved. But Chester A. Arthur did a turnaround. He went on to reform the spoil system. He created the penitent civil service system, which made working for the federal government based on qualifications and not on party affiliation. So he ended the patronage system, and of course that ticked off his patron and benefactor, former benefactor, Roscoe Conkling. And Roscoe Conkling resigned from the Senate and moved back to New York, and he ended his political career. Roscoe Conkling would die shortly after from, I think, was it a heart attack or something. He was a very fit man. He liked boxing. He was an athlete and all that. He was a very tall man, very imposing figure, but surprisingly he died suddenly of, I think, some kind of heart attack or something. Just suddenly. He didn't live long. But he made an indelible mark on U.S. politics. Again, just drafting being a main drafter of the 14th Amendment was sufficient. So Chester A. Arthur decided to reform the civil service, and of course he didn't gain a second term. He didn't have the confidence of his party, and after he left the presidency, he not too long after that, he died due to a terminal illness he had as well. It's interesting, he's also responsible for the first racist law in our immigration system. The first really racist xenophobic law, that's the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, right, which said Chinese people could not become could not become citizens of the United States. So if they couldn't become citizens, they couldn't become presidents, I guess. The Chinese Exclusion Act was excluding Chinese people from becoming citizens of the United States. So I thought I should talk about Chester A. Arthur. Very complex president. He was our 21st president. He had no plans. He had never won elective office. And he never sought elective office. He made more money than the President of the United States as a civil servant, as collector of the port of New York, right? And after James Garfield was assassinated, he became president and decided to end the spoil system. My name's Olurotimi Osha. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.